The beautiful Pacific Islands of Samoa. The year 1888. A multiple-part, multiple-claimant civil war is underway, with international backing for each side, including German colonial troops on the ground. After the victory of the Malietoa Lapepa, he was declared King of Samoa. Other claimants were exiled, but only after the German and American ships that had been facing off in Apia harbor for months were destroyed by a rogue storm that brought the international involvement to an end and began winding down the First Samoan Civil War. After the victory of the Malietoa, a tri-nation economic condominium was set up between the consuls of Germany, Britain, and America under the Kingdom of Samoa. But upon the Malietoa's death in 1898, the great powers were again eyeing each other in Samoa. This culminated in the 1899 Samoan intervention and the Second Samoan Civil War. August 22nd, 1898, on the island of Savaii, the northwesternmost point of Samoa, the King of Samoa, the Malietoa Lapepa, passed away, leaving vacant the kingship that had not existed for long and had only seen the elevation of one of the island chain's traditional tribal chiefs with the backing of the great powers in the First Samoan Civil War. Now, with the power vacuum created by the Malietoa's death, a second Samoan Civil War seemed inevitable, especially with Germany becoming increasingly aggressive. The chief they had eventually come around to backing during the First Samoan Civil War was the Mata'afa Yosefo, who had spent the last several years in exile on the Marshall Islands under German protection. Now the Germans returned him from his exile to Apia on November 1st, and he found that his previous backers were largely still supportive of his cause as they proclaimed Mata'afa Yosefo king on November 12th. However, there was strong resistance to this on the eastern islands, especially Tutuila, which supported the son of the deceased king, the Prince and Malietoa Tanu Mafili, nicknamed Prince Tanu by the British and Americans who came to support this faction. On December 31st, the Malietoa was declared king by the Supreme Court of Justice of Samoa, which had been set up by the three-nation condominium to govern the affairs of the islands, but the proclamation came from its current American Chief Justice, William Lee Chambers. The Germans and the Mata'afa supporters were outraged at this, as there were essentially now two claimants to the throne. Again, because the kingship was not a traditional system of government for the Samoans, there was no established succession practice. Because of this, skirmishes began to break out amongst supporters on both sides in and around Apia. The Mata'afa supporters crushed the Malietoa's few supporters on the island, and on January 4th he was forced to flee with a few of them aboard a British ship, along with the High Court, some of whose personnel also stowed away in the American and British consulates in Apia. Germany then dissolved the High Court. They named Mata'afa the head of all chiefs and declared a provisional government. Meanwhile, the Malietoa fled to Tutuila, where he remained living on the British ship in the harbor of Pongo Pongo, where he'd be forced to stay aboard for more than the next 2 months. The division of Samoa into rival factions marked the start of the Second Samoan Civil War. Now, at this point, a repeat of the 1889 crisis had begun to take shape, as both the Germans and British had a warship in Apia harbor. And this time, no storm was coming. Meanwhile, the Malietoa was forced to plot his return from Pongo Pongo while stowed away safely aboard the hold of a British ship. This existence, which can't have been pleasant, would last for nearly 10 weeks. 8 weeks later, on March 1st, an additional Royal Navy warship had arrived to supplement the HMS Porpoise, and by the 13th, the USS Philadelphia had arrived on the scene, bringing American support as well. The British Protection Force finally left Tutuila on the way to deliver the Malietoa and his supporters to Apia, where they could direct American and British-backed Samoan troops. They could also re-establish the royal claimant's hold on the capital of Apia. However, this was starting to look like it could be the beginning of an all-out war between the Germans and the Americans and British. As such, on March 14th, the American consulate sponsored talks with the provisional government. While this was going on, however, the Americans moved closer into the harbor. The American Admiral Albert Coutts had British and American forces land and try to secure the town, including securing a connection from the ports to the British and American consulates. However, these isolated consulates were attacked by the forces of Mataafa and his allies, and the forces attempting to take Apia had not yet reached them. As the staffs of the consulates held out, Coutts began the bombardment of the town from the sea, hitting the German consulate in the process, further threatening to turn this into a total war between the powers in the area. The Americans had secured most of Apia by the end of the day, and the Malietoa was delivered back to the city, where the British and American consulates, now safely back under the protection of British and American forces, reaffirmed the Malietoa's kingship over Samoa. Meanwhile, the warships were still facing off and threatening to do battle in the harbor. However, the Germans were mostly content to allow the Americans and British to struggle against the ground forces of the Mataafa, who had besieged the town of Apia for the better part of a week. On March 30th, the British and Americans broke the siege, and they now allowed the Malietoa-friendly Samoan forces to re-enter Apia to be fully armed and to bolster the British and American forces. On April 1st, even more British, American, and Royal Samoan forces landed in Apia in preparation for an assault on Vailele. The former German plantation at Vailele had been the scene of the bloodiest battles in the 1889 Samoan Civil War, and now a decade later it had become the stronghold of the Mataafa's forces attempting to hold off the intervention. In order to support the assault on Vailele, the British, Americans, and Royal Samoans landed at Falefa, where they had to win a couple of battles to secure control, but now they could attempt to attack Vailele from both sides. Near the 1889 battle site, the Battle of Vailele broke out, with the advance of the British, Americans, and Royal Samoans from the west ambushed by the German-backed Samoans fighting for the Mataafa. 800 troops under the command of Mataafa ambushed a much smaller force, with numerous notable stories of heroism emerging from the British and American forces, which were widely circulated in British and especially American newspapers, despite the chaotic retreat. Perhaps inspired by their comrades' valor, the British and Americans were not to be deterred, and a couple of days later they advanced to a position south of the Vailele stronghold. From there, both sides engaged in unsuccessful attacks against each other. However, with casualty counts increasing, it seemed like it was only a matter of time before the Germans directly sent their colonial troops to involve themselves, which would make the now proxy war into a direct war between Germany and America and Britain, a situation all sides wanted to avoid. Therefore, all three parties agreed to pursue a joint solution for the Samoa crisis. The Samoans on both sides were ordered to stay out of each other's way and respect a de facto ceasefire for the moment. However, this condition was unacceptable for the Mataafa supporters because it kept the Malietoa in control of Apia for the time being, and it in fact barred the Mataafa forces from even entering by crossing the front lines. As such, they attacked the Americans in the Second Battle of Apia on April 25th. However, the American patrol that was attacked successfully repelled the Samoans, and the Mataafa forces retreated back to Vailele. Following this, the Mataafa resigned with German prodding so that the great powers could come to a joint solution for the crisis. They agreed to appoint a joint commission, and representatives had arrived in Apia Harbor by May 13th. A week later, on the 20th, they organized talks between the Mataafa and Malietoa supporters. These went on for approximately 3 weeks, which didn't come to a conclusion, and at the end of which the Joint Commission, without seeking their signatures, agreed to dissolve the Kingdom of Samoa and to the eventual partition of Samoa between rival interests. On June the 10th, a new provisional government was declared for the entire island chain, and with the Joint Commission presiding, until the territory could be broken up via agreement. The great powers were not willing to risk further war over Samoa. Negotiations then commenced between the British and the Germans, partitioning Samoa. The local tribes supporting the chiefs of their own would now be kept separate, and a form of the original Samoan tribal system would now be restored. However, these would each now be under the sphere of influence of a great power, which could do with their territories what they wanted. By November 7th, a framework had been created. The islands would be divided along the 170 71st meridian, with the exception of Apollo and a couple of islands on its eastern shore, which would be included in the German sphere of influence along with Savaii. Meanwhile, America would get a sphere of influence, including Tutuila, the Manua Group, and the uninhabited Rose Atoll. The British agreed to take nothing, and in return for this, Germany agreed to concessions in the also contested Solomon Islands, where Germany agreed to give up several islands of German New Guinea to the British Solomon Islands. 2 days later, the agreement was signed in London and Berlin, with the British effectively representing the Americans in this interest. On the 14th, the Americans also agreed to it, as the USS Badger in the harbor at Apia hosted the consuls of all three powers, where they agreed to the terms of the Tripartite Convention, although Washington was of course yet to still officially sign the deal with London and Berlin. After this, the Malietoa realized the game was up, and with British protection he fled to Fiji, renouncing his claim to the throne of Samoa. Now, with the agreement already signed aboard the Badger, all that was left to be done was for Washington to approve the treaty. Back in the American capital, diplomats from all three powers, America, Britain, and Germany, signed the Tripartite Convention of 1899 on December 2nd, with diplomatic ratification from all three powers coming February 16th of the next year. In 1899, the American Navy had begun constructing a base at Pongo Pongo in the naturally protected harbor there, and given that this was now in the American sphere of influence, and the Americans had free hand over the territory, on February 19, 1900, the American President, William McKinley, issued an executive order annexing the island of Tutuila for the under-construction Navy base and declaring the American intent on all of eastern Samoa within their sphere of influence under the 1899 convention. The American naval station Tutuila became a staple of American naval operations in the Pacific during the first half of the 20th century. So on February 19, 1900, Pongo Pongo became the capital of the new American military administration on Tutuila, while on March 1st, the Germans and Kaiser Wilhelm II declared their annexation of Apollo, Savaii, and their nearby islands to the west of the demarcation line, while the Americans also claimed the uninhabited Rose Atoll. The only part of Samoa not yet under control of the powers was the Manua Group. After several weeks of negotiations, their chiefs agreed to accept American sovereignty, but opened negotiations on the specific structure of their relationship to the American authorities, a relationship they knew was inevitable. And as the islands came under American control, these negotiations would continue for several years. Meanwhile, the Mataafa, having missed out on the kingship, was declared as the highest chief by the German colonial government, and he would resume his rule locally under the German colonial administration for another dozen years until his death. Just over 4 years later, on July 16, 1904, the final conditions of the cession of Manua were signed by the tribal chiefs, as their official relationship with the American authorities was now defined. The territory, however, was still referred to as Tutuila, leaving out the presence of the Manua group. The Manua chiefs and their populations were thus allowed to help pick a new name for the territory, with the final decision made on July 7, 1911, and approved by the American Navy. The territory was renamed American Samoa, with its capital still at Pongo Pongo, and the American and British-backed tribal chiefs still in control over this portion of the territory, while the German-backed tribal chiefs under Mataafa continued their local control in the west. Today, the western Samoan Islands are independent, while Pongo Pongo in the east remain in American possession. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like the video, comment, subscribe, donate on Patreon. By the way, we just got our first Patreon donor. Huge thank you there. That certainly opens up the possibility of more future videos. So check that out, and make sure to check out our other videos and playlists on our channel page. Again, thank you so much. I'm Alex. I'm out.